Hello and welcome to Mrs. E English Skills. I'm Mrs. E and today we're looking at Functional Skills English Level 2, Language Features and Devices. Types of text. Text is any piece of writing, and there are many different types with many different purposes. In order to find out the purpose, you will need to ask a couple of questions. Why has it been written? What does the author want to achieve? Depending on its purpose, an author will use different language and organisational features to get the message across, and we'll be looking at these today. A text can have many purposes: to entertain, to argue, to analyse, to explain. However, they can all be summed up in four main purposes of text. They are to inform, to instruct, to persuade, and to describe. Let's learn some language devices. Starting with similes. A simile is a figure of speech in which two things that are not obviously like each other are compared to make a description more vivid. A simile will often begin with a phrase introduced by like or as. For example, the cowardly boy was trembling like a leaf. The old man's hands were as cold as ice. The young girl could swim like a fish. Baby Jane was as good as gold at the christening. The young boy ran like the wind. Moving on to metaphors. Metaphors are like concentrated similes. Two dissimilar things are compared, but rather than saying one is like the other, a metaphor goes a stage further and makes one thing become another. So let's see some examples. She was fairly certain that life was a fashion show. A wave of nausea washed over him. The children were roses grown in concrete gardens. I'm having a nightmare of a day. Life isn't a fashion show. Nausea is not a wave like the ocean. You can't be having a nightmare in the middle of the day as you're not asleep. And children aren't roses. That's why all four of these are metaphors. Let's see three more. On to onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia is when the word used conveys the sound of the description. For example, bang, snap, crunch, boom. It allows the reader to hear the description as well as see it. And next we look at alliteration. Alliteration is the repetition of the initial consonant sounds in two or more neighbouring words or syllables. For example, you'll never put a better bit of butter on your knife. This is an advertising slogan for Country Life Butter. You can see the B sound is repeated, which makes it more memorable. Another example is a moist young moon hung above the mist of a neighbouring meadow. This is from Conclusive Evidence by Vladimir Nabokov, 1951. This is slightly different. Yes, it's memorable, but the repetition of the sound makes the description much softer, which suits the scene that it's describing. Lastly, Personification. Personification occurs when something that is not a person is described as if it were. It could be in the way something looks, moves, sounds, or some other aspect of it. For example, you could describe an object as if it were alive. The bus groaned as it came to a stop. Groaned is a human emotion, which makes it personification. You could describe an animal as if it were a person. The cunning fox smiled with a self-satisfied grin. A person can smile and feel self-satisfied, whereas a fox cannot. Or you could describe an abstract idea as if it were alive. Terror stalked the children with every step they took. Let's practice identifying language devices. There are 3 examples in front of you. A. The computer grumbled into life before smugly informing me that it was starting on 6 hours of updates. B. The buzz and chatter of the students ruined the tranquility of the scene. And C. Bag a bargain at Bridgeson's, Portsmouth's premier pig farm. Pause the video here to have a go at labelling the techniques that have been used in each example. Okay, let's look at the answers. If a computer grumbles and smugly informs somebody, that means it sounds as if it's a person. So that must be an example of personification. Words such as buzz and chatter convey the sound. So that's an example of onomatopoeia. And bag a bargain at Bridgeson's, the repetition of the initial B sound, and P sound for Portsmouth's premier pig farm, that's an example of alliteration. How did you do? Finally, I'd like to talk about rhetoric. A definition of rhetoric is language designed to have a persuasive or impressive effect, but which is often regarded as lacking in sincerity or meaningful content. This just means it's manipulative in its nature. There are lots of rhetorical techniques, but for level 2, you're expected to know about the following. Rhetorical questions. Questions that don't need an answer, or questions where the answer is implied. For example, if I was writing a campaign or a leaflet trying to get my audience to donate some money each month to help children in areas of poverty, I might ask a question such as, is this the life you'd like for your children? The obvious answer is no, but what I'm doing is I'm manipulating you through your use of emotions. Rule of 3 or triple. This is when I list 3 things, such as 3 adjectives. In my example, I have Farmageddon is a frightening, horrifying, yet exhilarating experience. When you list 3 things rather than 2, it adds extra emphasis and therefore is more persuasive. Lastly, hyperbole. I'm absolutely frozen solid. Hyperbole is an over-exaggeration. This is also persuasive as it makes it seem more or less, depending on what it is you're saying, than it actually is. So it's more dramatic and therefore more persuasive. So let's do a bit of exam practice. The exam will ask you to identify language techniques and label them. So can you identify any of the features, the devices we've explored today? Let's read a piece of text. Who has not felt outraged at the injustice of the world when viewing images of child poverty? We live in a world where millions of children must battle with hunger, thirst and poor sanitation every day. Your donation, if you can find it in your heart to give one, will truly change these children's lives for the better. Pause the video here to identify and label the language devices. Let's look at the answers. Here is the text again, but I have changed the colour of the words where I have identified the language techniques. Who has not felt outraged at the injustice of the world when viewing images of child poverty? We have a rhetorical question and the clue is in the question mark. Then we have children must battle with hunger, thirst and poor sanitation. That's an example of rule of 3 or triple, whatever you prefer to call it. I've also added 2 extra techniques in here. We've not talked about them today due to the constraints of the video length, but we also have an example of bias. Will truly change these children's lives for the better. So it's an opinion, but it's an opinion that will convince you to put your hands in your pockets, make a donation, help the campaign. So bias is when there is something in it for the author. We'll talk about this in a separate video, but this is something to bear in mind. Then I've got direct address. Whenever you use the words you, we or us, you are addressing the reader as if you are talking to them face to face. You are pulling them into the text. So if you can find it in your heart. This is also emotive language. How did you do? Thank you for watching. Don't forget to check out my other videos to keep improving your English, and also keep an eye on this playlist for more videos to help you with your functional skills English level 2 exams. If you've got a question, just add a comment and I'll try my best to answer. As always, I'm Mrs. E, and I'll see you soon.